It was a busy couple of weeks in international affairs. The day after the British Grand Prix, Yitzhak Rabin took office as the Prime Minister of Israel, following the Labour Party's victory in the election 3 weeks earlier. Rabin had been PM before, between 1974 and 77, during which time he sent troops into Uganda to end the hostage crisis at Entebbe Airport, but also signed agreements that laid the groundwork for the Camp David Accords of 1979. His 1992 election campaign played on his previous popularity and also promised to revive the seemingly stalled Middle East peace process. And as an early sign of intent, the new government agreed to freeze new settlements on the occupied territories. A few days after that, the Democratic National Convention officially adopted Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton as their candidate to challenge the incumbent George Bush for the presidency in November, with Tennessee Senator Al Gore as his running mate. The conference was seen to have gone well, with Don't Stop by Fleetwood Mac a recurring theme, and Clinton also gained a boost in the polls when independent candidate Ross Perot announced that he was withdrawing from the race too. The day after that, the Slovak National Council announced that Slovakia was an independent country and that Czechoslovakia would break into two, just shy of 3/4 of a century after its foundation. The two parts had never been entirely happy welded together into one country, going right back to their history as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when the Czech half was administered from Vienna and the Slovak half from Budapest, and much ink had been spilled between the wars over whether the nation should have a hyphen in the middle of its name or not, to emphasise it was two equal countries. President Václav Havel announced his resignation rather than preside over the end of his country, which was due to take effect on the 1st of January 1993. The war in Transnistria petered out with a ceasefire after 4 months. President Yeltsin had given the Transnistrian separatists considerable military aid, which the Moldovans couldn't hope to overcome, and the war was becoming more and more unpopular in Moldova at large. Russian troops would gradually be drawn down to a strength of a few thousand peacekeepers and observers, and Transnistria remained in limbo, effectively independent, but unrecognised by pretty much anyone except Russia, a situation which continues to this day. Abkhazia declared its independence from Georgia, which was then in the process of joining the United Nations. The Soviet Republic of Georgia had included a couple of autonomous regions with their own ethnic identities, though over the years the populations of those areas had become mixed, which had led to tensions around the time of the breakup of the USSR. By 1992, the Abkhaz and other Northern Caucasian peoples had become minorities in their own autonomous land, with ethnic Georgians forming the majority. Georgia in particular was having a very difficult birth as an independent nation, with another ethnic conflict ongoing in South Ossetia and a recent coup and subsequent civil strife in which former Soviet Foreign Minister Edvard Shevardnadze had ousted elected President Zviad Gamsakhurdia. Against all of this international turmoil, the Olympic Games opened on the Saturday of Grand Prix weekend in Barcelona. The international situation was reflected in the list of participants. Germany took part in their first Summer Games as a unified country since the 1930s, and Yemen ever, while as it turned out Czechoslovakia were entering their last. The UN sanctions on Yugoslavia meant that their team could not compete, but a compromise was reached whereby individual Serbian and Montenegrin athletes, but not teams, could enter as independent Olympic athletes. Slovenia and Croatia sent teams, as they had to the Winter Games in Albertville, and 10 athletes from Bosnia and Herzegovina made it too. Their original flight had been cancelled by the UN peacekeepers due to yet another broken ceasefire, so the IOC chartered a plane to come and get them. And just as at the Winter Games in Albertville, the 3 Baltic states sent teams, while the remaining former Soviet republics entered as the unified team under the Olympic flag. South Africa also returned for their first Games since 1960, following the lifting of apartheid sanctions, and Namibia after gaining independence from South Africa. It was a busy time for flag makers. King Juan Carlos I, who had competed in sailing at the 1972 Games, opened the proceedings, culminating in the lighting of the Olympic flames by Paralympic archer Antonio Rebollo, who lit a flaming arrow from the relay torch and fired it towards the cauldron. Camera angles were carefully set up to make it look as if the arrow landed in the cauldron and lit the flame, but in fact, for safety reasons, it was aimed to fly over the top and injure the gas being emitted. In any case, it looked spectacular. There was much for the Germans to cheer, even though they'd had a footballing disappointment of their own over the summer. Because as well as their unified Olympic team, the largest after the US and unified teams, and hoping for a good medal haul, for the first time in a very long time, this car-mad nation had a Formula 1 driver with a decent chance of actually winning. OK, he hadn't won yet, but this was after all only his 16th race. But he'd been on the podium enough that he was a reasonable shout, but only it seemed if something happened to both Williamses. After their collision in France and long period running nose to tail in Britain, a rivalry had developed between Schumacher and Ayrton Senna, which flared up again when the triple champion claimed that the rookie had balked him during a FOCA test session between races. Words were exchanged, and depending on which source you read, Senna either grabbed Schumacher by the scruff of the neck or slapped him in the face, but neither man would be drawn by the media. The German media could be as relentless as the British, and Italian sporting presses and stories surfaced a few days before the race that Michael Schumacher had stolen his girlfriend Corinna from his former Mercedes teammate Heinz-Harald Frentzen, but again Schumacher didn't dignify the story with a comment, except to say that he now sympathised with Boris Becker's comments about press intrusion. After the delirium of Silverstone, it was back to work for Max and Bernie as the arguments about 1993 regulations in fuel and tyres continued. Having agreed in principle that fuel should be standardised across the grid, now the argument had moved on to how to define that standard, while Moseley, Eccleston and Goodyear were having a three-way spat about reducing the width of the rear tyres from 18 to 15 inches. Thanks to a bit of chicanery, Moseley was able to give Goodyear an ultimatum: accept the change or pull out of F1 entirely to be replaced by Avon, a manufacturer with a strong link to Bernie Eccleston, which already equipped the F3000 grid. Things were looking up for Ferrari, where the rumours were that John Barnard was back, tempted away from Toyota's putative F1 project on a 5-year contract which would allow him to continue working from Guildford as a kind of satellite to Maranello and general oversight over all technical staff. Less rosy though for Ivan Capelli. He'd been told that he would be looking for a new job in 1993, and Ferrari's advisor Niki Lauda had been scathing in his analysis of Ivan's driving technique after the FOCA test. Quote, "If you've been driving like that for 12 years, you've been wrong from the start." Ivan was open in his criticism of the disparity in cars between himself and Jean, and was glumly looking to maybe Jordan or Ligier for next year. Certainly Jordan's current Italian Stefano Modena didn't appear to be in Eddie's good books, the Irishman deriding him for being lazy, though whether that was true, a side effect of being demotivated by a terrible car, or just classic Eddie Jordan mind games, was known only to him. Olivier Guillau's sponsorship deal was due to end shortly, and indeed it was only the unavailability of Italian Emanuele Naspetti that saved his seat for Germany, while over at Fondmetal Andrea Chiesa was similarly out of cash and out of luck. The team had 2 of their new GR02s with them, both for Tarquini. After all, Chiesa had had one and crashed it. And Paul Belmondo was also on borrowed time, funded until Hungary, the next race, with Michael Schumacher's alleged love rival Heinz-Harald Frentzen apparently lined up to replace him. For this race only, the sky blue cars would bear a familiar name: Real. March co-owner Gustav Brunner and Real owner Günther Schmidt went way back to the late 70s and ATS, and hadn't always got on, understatement of the year, but the unpredictable Schmidt had thrown a few marks their way for a one-off sponsorship. And at Andrea Moda, another new sporting director, one Sergio Zago, and Sassetti and McCarthy had a meeting in which Perry had been told flat out that he'd only been hired to avoid a FISA penalty, so that was that. Pell was let out to do a single timed PQ lap with a Dickey engine, and was so furious that he missed the weigh-in and got himself excluded for his trouble, not that it really mattered, while Moreno missed the cut as usual, but was only 4/10 off a demoralised Chiesa in the old Fondmetal. It was Tarquini on top of the heat this time, with Gasho a quarter of a second behind, followed 8/10 back by Katayama. Hockenheim had had some improvements since last year with a new pit and paddock complex, but most noticeably on track the Ostkurve chicane had been reprofiled and given full gravel traps. Unfortunately, it hadn't been resurfaced very well and everyone was hitting the bumps hard, plus if anyone did go off, they would spray gravel all over the track in front of them. So it was hardly surprising that the Williamses, with their active suspension, proved once again absolutely dominant in qualifying, with the likewise actively sprung McLarens on row 2. Alesi was 5th with the grunty Ferrari V12 but 3 seconds off pole, followed by Schumacher in the V8 Benetton. Up on row 4 with the 2 Ligiers, that Renault V10 Power doing the work, ahead of Brundle and a much improved Wendlinger. The Lotai were a little disappointed in 11th and 12th after their Silverstone heroics, having had problems with their own active ride. They bracketed a depressed Capelli and were just ahead of Olivier Guillard, who had belatedly found some speed and outqualified de Cesaris, who'd blown an engine. The Footworks and Venturis were well down compared to their recent form, and the Jordans had no downforce or grip to go with the no power from their asthmatic Yamaha V12 engines. Gugelmin at least got a decent lap by following in his buddy Senna's slipstream. The rulebook had a lot about not impeding other drivers, it doesn't actually say anything about not helping them, but a demoralised Modena missed out alongside an equally demoralised Chiesa and the Brabham boys, Hill once again slowest of all, with a time that would have put him third in pre-qualifying. That meant at least that Zanardi would get his first start for Minardi, outqualifying both his own teammate and Bertrand Gachot, who only scraped in after detonating 3 Lamborghini V12s in the attempt to set a time. Under sunny skies, the green lights came on, and just as 2 weeks earlier, Patrese got away like a scalded cat and headed into the first corner ahead of Mansell, with Berger likewise getting the drop on his teammate to go third, while the Benettons both surged past a slow-starting Alesi. Mansell's gearbox had skipped second gear and put him straight from first into third, which had slowed him a little bit, but it didn't take long for him to reassert himself down the first straight, again mirrored by the McLarens as Senna retook third from Berger. Schumacher put a wheel on the gravel at chicane 3 but recovered before Brundle could take advantage, as a fast-starting Capelli elbowed his way past the Ligiers to make it Williams, McLaren, Benetton, Ferrari, Ligier, Lotus in places 1 through 12 at the end of the first lap, with Mansell already stretching out his customary early lead. Zanardi's Minardi debut was short, having burned out his clutch, and he pulled in to retire, while Aguri Suzuki got his foot hooked around his steering column somehow, missed his braking point, and ended up in a sand trap at the entrance to the stadium on lap 2. The Williamses were pulling away as usual, with a 4-car McLaren Benetton train developing behind, as Wendlinger spun at the third chicane and came in for new boots, and the German TV director showed off the slow-mo capabilities of his new cameras. The Benettons had started on harder tyres than the McLarens, but nonetheless the yellow and green cars had been consistently lapping a few miles an hour quicker than the red and white ones over the weekend. But that didn't help Schumacher get past Berger now, and the McLaren was able to stay comfortably ahead, though not pull away. Katayama was the new Ostkurve's first victim, pirouetting gracefully into the gravel, while Guillard went out with an overheating Ilmor before he could serve his penalty for jumping the start, though not as flagrantly as in France, and Wendlinger had to come back in with stone still in his radiator grills after his off-track excursion. It was just about a quarter distance by now, and Mansell was cruising, a comfy 5 seconds ahead of Patrese, while the chasing pack had split up a bit, with Senna a couple of seconds ahead of the scrapping Berger and Schumacher, who had in turn pulled away from Brundle. Herbert came in for tyres on lap 12, followed a lap later by Mansell, whose dashboard had erroneously showed him losing tyre pressure and he suspected a puncture. He had planned to stop, but not just yet, and it interrupted a series of fastest laps for the leader. An 8.1 second stop put him out third after Patrese and Senna. Berger also came in, having felt something come loose at the back. The team changed the tyres and sent him back out, but he was back in the following lap with a misfiring engine. His tyres were changed on autopilot, of course, but there was still something wrong with his engine, and he was wheeled off to have it looked at. With Schumacher released from behind the Austrian, he got his foot down, setting his own fastest lap as Patrese made his way through the back markers with an 8-second gap back to Senna, who had Mansell bearing down on him. And further back and off-camera, a feisty Gabriele Tarquini had overtaken Hakkinen to take 10th place. The Finn was back past a couple of laps later, but the Fun Motor was definitely running well. Mansell was back on Senna's gearbox before much longer, and as they approached de Cesaris to lap him, Mansell had a go into chicane 1. Senna slammed the door, but Mansell remained glued to the McLaren's rear wing, only to miss his braking point at the Ostkurve and shoot across the escape road without losing much time at all. He was passed next time as they approached chicane 3 and began to pull away as Patrese peeled in for tyres, so Mansell went through into the lead. The Italian returned to the track between the two Benettons, who were hoping to go the full race without stopping. Berger headed out several laps down, more to see if they'd managed to fix whatever it was than out of any hope of getting something out of the race, as his countryman Wendlinger made his third stop, his ballast having worked loose and needing its securing bolt tightening. It was not turning out to be a great day for him. Capelli rolled to a stop, his 8th retirement in 10 races, with a dead engine, as Berger finally gave up and followed suit, and Hakkinen's Ford HB gave out in the outfield, leaving the Finn with a long walk back. Senna, meanwhile, had decided to stay out rather than change tyres, and indeed was happily staying ahead of Schumacher, who was rather busier fending off Patrese than chasing Senna. They all passed Tarquini, who'd also pitted for tyres and was making his way back up, with Patrese on fresh tyres really charging at Schumacher on his older ones. Lotus's afternoon ended on lap 23, just about half distance, as Johnny Herbert pulled over with a lack of fuel pressure, and all the time Patrese was worrying at Schumacher as the pair passed Tarquini in their turn. But the German was defending well, so as the second half got underway, Mansell led Senna by about 9 seconds, then Schumacher, another 3 seconds back with Patrese on his tail, Brundle 10 seconds behind them in 5th, and a lazy 20 seconds adrift of him in 6th. Schumacher took a chance in passing Gasho under braking for the Ostkurve, preventing himself from getting held up and putting a car between himself and Patrese, albeit not for long, as Patrese continued pushing. And all this time, Mansell was flying, setting a new fastest lap pretty much every time round and stretching his lead over Senna to 13 seconds. It continued to be nip and tuck between Schumacher and Patrese, a couple of hairy moments as they lapped the Dalaras, but still, Ricciardo just couldn't get past. Eventually, though, on lap 33, the extended pressure seemed to get to Michael as the pair approached the Ostkurve and Gianni Morbidelli. Patrese went left to go round the outside, Schumacher braked but too hard and fishtailed, allowing the Williams through. It had been a great display of defence by the young German against a veteran in a faster car on fresher tyres, but once past, Patrese disappeared off into the distance in pursuit of Senna, 7 seconds ahead with 12 laps still to go. Tarquini fell by the wayside with a blown engine, a shame after his fine race, as it was Patrese's turn to break the lap record as he pursued Senna and second place. His lap of 1:41.989, nearly 2.5 seconds faster than his fastest lap the previous year, albeit at a slightly amended track. Senna, for his part, had been told by the team how well Schumacher had held Patrese off and thought he could probably manage too, but still sped up to delay the amount of time he'd have to, albeit on worn tyres, which limited his ability to really push, as Patrese knocked another 4/10 off the lap record, just nudging his average speed for the lap over the 150 mph mark. Lap 39 of 45 and Patrese had just about caught Senna, but wrecked his tyres in the process. He had a look at the third chicane, but Senna shut the door, and while Senna's defensive technique was different to Schumacher's, it was no less effective, as the laps ticked down. Patrese scrubbed a bit more off his tyres under braking for the Ostkurve on lap 41. It seemed as if he was getting a bit ragged, a little impatient, perhaps still pumped with adrenaline after his battle with Schumacher in his pursuit of Senna. Another moment for Ricciardo on lap 43, as he took the Nordkurve too fast, put 2 wheels in the dirt, and did very well to catch a spin, and had it all to do again with 2 laps to go. And a lap later he was back on it, right in Senna's wheel tracks with just a lap and a half to go. He had a go at the second chicane, chopped off by Senna again, as the pair were suddenly reeling in Mansell at a rate of knots, the Briton having throttled right back after getting a fuel warning. The gap was down to just over 5.5 seconds by the time they all began the last lap. Through the second chicane, Patrese looked and Senna shut the door again, and then they were going into the stadium, and the last overtaking opportunity of the race. Patrese looked inside, Senna held his line, Patrese braked just a bit too hard on the dusty part of the track and went spinning off into the grass and stalled his engine. Mansell took the checkered flag just 4.5 seconds ahead of Senna in the end, with Schumacher overjoyed to come in an unexpected third in his first outing at his home Grand Prix. Fortunate, but well deserved after his great scrap with Patrese. Brundle was fourth after an anonymous race which he'd completed despite being in some severe back pain, with a lazy fifth, and Jochen Mass promoted into the points to finish sixth, followed by his teammate Boutsen. Patrese was classified 8th, just ahead of Michele Alboreto, who broke his streak of 7th places, but in the wrong direction. 16 cars finished overall, the last of them Carl Wendlinger 3 laps down after all his problems, while Paul Belmondo in the other march maintained his 100% record of finishing every race he started for the team. Mansell's win had put him level with Senna for the record of most race wins in a season, 8, but with 6 races still to go he was almost certain to break it. Perhaps more importantly though, despite Senna's second place, he was now mathematically out of contention for the championship, while Patrese's retirement meant that Mansell would need to score 4 more points than Patrese to secure the title at the next race in Hungary. But the day after the race, Mansell had a meeting scheduled with Frank Williams to discuss his future at the team. Prost, while naming no names, was also saying that he was keen to get something in place for next year, while Senna had been seen talking to Niki Lauda with rumours that he would be replacing Ivan Capelli at Ferrari and demoting Alesi back down to number 2. Even in its current doldrums, Senna at Ferrari was a very tasty prospect. For his part, Patrese was complimentary about Senna's professionalism in defending his line, in contrast with Schumacher, who he felt had done rather too much in the way of weaving and late braking, but admitted he'd made mistakes and was just not really gelling with the active suspension. There were 3 weeks to go now between the German and Hungarian Grand Prix, which would no doubt pass very slowly for Nigel Mansell, knowing that he could just be one more race away from that elusive world title.